has anybody never been to Fort Macon? 2? Is that it? Most folks have probably been here, especially folks in Wayne County, because we come to the beach down here a lot, and you find something fun for the kids to do when you come down to the beach, especially when it's raining. And I assume that's probably the first time I came to Fort Macon. I remember it vividly. I was 5 years old. It was 1962. And do the math, I'm 55, okay. It was 1962, and I was sort of smitten with the place, but I didn't even really know what it was about. In fact, I remember going, the next time we came to the beach, we went to Wilmington, and I kept saying, I want to go to that fort. And they said, well, that's the wrong beach. And I called it the Silver War. I didn't even know what it meant, but I was 5 years old. But I knew I liked it, and I vividly remember standing in the parade looking in one of the windows and seeing a federal, what I didn't know at the time was a federal officer's frock coat. I just called it the blue suit with the yellow buttons, and just got very interested in it. And most folks come down here when you go to the beach. You probably come down here at least occasionally. But have you ever wondered, when you come down to Fort Macon, why is there a Fort Macon? It's honestly, if you take away the road into this place, if you take away Amos mosquitoes, if you take away the condos and the boats and all that good stuff, this is really in the middle of nowhere. I mean, this is sort of a jumping off place. About the only thing that really commands attention around here at the time this fort was built would have been the port at Beaufort, which was a deep water port. Very important for North Carolina to have a deep water port in this neck of the woods, so to speak. And to answer the question why there is a Fort Macon, or why is it in this particular place, you only have to know that Beaufort is here. That's the important thing. And the story really starts in 1747 when the Spanish came through Beaufort Inlet, and we're going to see when we get up top, it's a little hard to see from here, but you're going to see Beaufort Inlet is directly behind me over here. The Spanish came through in 1747. They ransacked and plundered the port at Beaufort. The British did the same thing in 1782. Happened again in the War of 1812. And this is sort of getting old, so a fort was built here, actually 2 forts. The last one was called Fort Hampton. It was a much smaller fort than this, and it was after few short months or years, it was washed into the ocean. This is a very tough climate down here to put a fort down because of the changing sands. That's something Fort Macon ended up having a problem with as well after it was built. Well, in the 1820s, the War Department decided they needed some sort of a system of forts along the coast, including in North Carolina. They wanted something specifically that they could use to defend the port at Beaufort. And so in 1826, plans were drawn up and construction was begun on Fort Macon. It took about 8 years to complete. And this, not much for statistics generally, but this blows my mind. There are 9.2 million bricks in this fort. An estimated anybody ever had anybody doing brickwork at their house? How expensive that is? Can you imagine paying somebody to lay 9.2 million bricks? Well, it only cost $463,000 to build this fort, which was a princely sum at the time, but you can't build a Bojangles for that these days. Now, to give you an idea of the cost of the workmanship and the material that went into this place, it is a pentagonal shaped solid masonry fort. It consists of 26 vaulted casemates for troops. It could mount between 50 and 60 heavy guns, and at any given time you might have a garrison here at full strength of around 500 men or a little bit less. You could probably put a few more than that, but that's kind of crowding it a little bit. That's what it's really designed to handle, is between 400 and 500 men. As soon as the fort is built, the garrison comes in here beginning in 1834. And things go pretty well in Fort Macon for about 6 years. And then all of a sudden everyone realizes, you know, does it look like to anybody but me that the ocean's getting a little close to us? And all of a sudden they realize the ocean is eating away the beach, and the ocean is lapping, and we'll see it when we get up front, I'll show you. The ocean is lapping actually on the road where we just drove in. It's gotten that close to it. So the War Department calls on a gifted, sort of up-and-coming young captain of engineers. His name is Robert E. Lee. Might have heard of him. He's in the United States Army at this point. And he's dispatched here in November and December of 1840 to do an assessment of the fort. Captain Lee comes here. He walks through these very doors. This is called the Sally Port. This is the front door of the fort. Walks through those doors, and he spends a good amount of time here making recommendations that go back up the chain of command to the War Department. And what he says is you need to put 5 rock jetties out in front of this fort, straight out into the ocean. That'll catch the sand. Now, keep in mind, this is not really his specialty, but it turns out he was absolutely right. The beach is renourished, and we have, at least in part, Captain Lee to thank for having Fort Macon today, because it was very close to being washed into the Atlantic Ocean. So we do have Fort Macon. Thank you, Captain Lee. Well, after Captain Lee leaves in 1840, about the next 21 years, things are pretty quiet here. If you think about it, this isn't a period of great foreign entanglements for the United States, not at least that are going to involve Fort Macon or Beaufort, and so the fort sort of goes into mothball status. There's not a lot going on at this point. First, the heavy guns are taken out, and one by one, companies are taken out, and other companies are taken out, and you end up on the eve of the American Civil War with exactly a garrison of one man. He's 52 years old, he's an ordnance sergeant, and his name is William Alexander. He's the only man in the fort. He's not the only person in the fort. He has with him his 21-year-old wife. They have a lovely time in the fort here, I'm sure. They have it all to themselves. They have it all to themselves, and everything goes wonderful for Sergeant Alexander and his young bride until April 1861, and I'm sure you all know what that means. This is the firing on Fort Sumter in Charleston Harbor, South Carolina. When this occurs, the winds of war are kind of blowing towards North Carolina, but North Carolina is always kind of shooing them away. This is not really a heavy secessionist state. North Carolina was kind of dragged screaming and kicking into secession, but the firing upon Fort Sumter and President Lincoln's call for 75,000 volunteers to put down the rebellion really galvanized secessionist feeling in North Carolina. And all of a sudden, you have a very strong secessionist feeling within a day or so of the firing of Fort Sumter and Lincoln's call for troops. Well, there's a group over in Beaufort at this time called the Beaufort Harbor Guards. It's a militia group. There are only about 17 or 18 of them, but they have lots of friends and neighbors, and they gather down around about 50 men or so. They come across the channel over here. They march down this very gangplank. That's different wood, but it's exactly at the right angle. The piers are the same. And they come and knock on the front door. Those are the doors. And I'm sure Sergeant Alexander sort of meekly looks out and says, well, what's this all about? And they demand the surrender of the fort on behalf of the people of North Carolina. Well, he's not in a very good position to tell them no. He doesn't even have a pistol. He's requisitioned a pistol from the War Department, but they basically told him, if you want a pistol, you can buy it with your own funds. We're not going to send you anything down here. He's basically a caretaker. He carries a little rusty set of keys around and just checks on the fort from time to time, lives inside the fort. With that, he is escorted out of the fort with his young wife, and he's taken over to Beaufort. He is set free, and if I'm not mistaken, I think he'll live the rest of his life in Beaufort. I think he's buried there. With this, the Confederate troops, the Beaufort Harbor Guards, go into the fort. They take command of it on behalf of the people of the state of North Carolina. There's just one little problem with this. North Carolina has not seceded from the Union. And this puts Governor John Ellis, the governor of the state, in a little bit of a pickle because, people in his state have just taken over a federal military installation. And he might have been, I suppose, tempted at first to tell them, I'm sorry, here's the fort back, we didn't mean to do it. But he's a pretty astute politician, and he understands that after President Lincoln makes a call for troops, that the secessionist fever is rampant in North Carolina, and he decides he's going to keep the fort. He's not only going to keep it, he's going to sort of double down. He puts in a call down to Goldsboro, North Carolina, the first of several what I call Wayne County connections that we have with Fort Macon. And he calls up a militia group in Goldsboro that's much larger and better armed and sort of a little less ragtag than the Beaufort Harbor Guards. It's called the Goldsboro Rifles. He calls the Goldsboro Rifles and 2 or 3 other units. They make their way down here by train. They take possession of the fort to the great consternation of the Beaufort Harbor Guards. They thought they were heroes for having taken the fort. And they probably were in some respects, but anyway, this becomes now a Confederate military installation. For the next year or so, the Confederates put this on a war footing. They bring 54 heavy guns into the fort. They have a garrison here of about 400 men, and they're basically ready for whatever they think the Union is going to throw at them. And the Union, during this entire time, the War Department up in Washington, they've not been sitting still. As early as September of 1861, the War Department has been making plans to try to do something about making an incursion into the interior of North Carolina. These are pretty smart guys at the War Department. They know how to read a map, and they look at a map, and here's our second Wayne County connection for the tour. They zero right in on a little town called Goldsboro, North Carolina. Goldsboro, North Carolina at that point is one of the most important cities in the South, and I would venture to say possibly in the country in some respects, because it is the nexus of 2 important railroads, the Atlantic in North Carolina and the Wilmington-Weldon Railroad. These 2 railroads intersect in Goldsboro. Because of that, Goldsboro becomes the headquarters, the military headquarters of the Department of North Carolina for the Confederacy. There are hospitals located. There are troops there. Goldsboro is what you call solid gold real estate in the American Civil War. The feeling among the war planners at the War Department is that if we can get a toehold on the coast of North Carolina, by taking places like Fort Macon and Beaufort and Morehead City and New Bern, Roanoke Island, Hatteras Island, these kind of places. It gives us sort of jumping off place to make a dash inland to Goldsboro, sever the railroad line there. The thinking being that if the railroad line at Goldsboro is cut, that's going to cut the flow of supplies coming from the deep south and from the port at Wilmington. You got to remember, most of the supplies coming from Atlanta, from Charleston, from Savannah, come by train to Wilmington. They then are put on boxcars and flat cars, and they're brought up across the Neuse River just south of Goldsboro, about where the fairgrounds is located. There are large supply warehouses in Goldsboro. Then you have all the goods and supplies coming in from Great Britain, ships running the naval blockade under the protection of the guns at Fort Fisher. All the supplies, they're put on the trains at Wilmington. They also have to come up to Goldsboro. So the feeling is that if these supplies can be kept bottled up in Goldsboro by destroying, for instance, the railroad bridge across the Neuse River south of town, or preferably capturing Goldsboro if you have enough men and material to be able to do that, then this is going to put a real kink in the supply line for the Confederacy. The idea being that if this could be done in conjunction with a major Union attack and victory elsewhere, let's say in Virginia, then a defeated Confederate army in the vicinity of the capital at Richmond can be denied resupply, swept aside, the capital at Richmond can be taken, and the war can be brought to a speedy conclusion. So this is how Goldsboro sort of fits into this picture, and that is really the theme for this weekend. It's the Civil War on the Neuse River in 1862, the events that occurred 150 years ago along the Neuse River, including at Fort Macon and Goldsboro, and this is how this all fits together. You get to have basically two important events in North Carolina in 1862 as far as the war is considered. One is called the Burnside Expedition, and that occurs beginning in February 1862. And then in December you have what's called Foster's Raid, and they both have as their ultimate objective the capture of Goldsboro or the destruction of the railroad at Goldsboro. The first of these we're going to talk about today is going to be the Burnside Expedition, and tomorrow morning when we are at New Bern, we'll be talking about the Burnside Expedition. Well, to put this plan into place, General Burnside, Ambrose Burnside, you've probably all seen pictures of the man with the big bushy sideburns. That's where the name Sideburns comes from. He's placed in command of a group of soldiers called a Coastal Division, and they're training up at Fortress Monroe, Virginia. He raises 12,000 troops. He has about 80 ships, and in February he sails them down from Fortress Monroe, and he attacks and captures Roanoke Island. This gives him the first initial toehold on the coast of North Carolina. Then he picks his next target, and his next target is going to be New Bern. So we're doing this slightly out of schedule. New Bern actually was taken before Fort Macon, but it made better sense on the trip to do Fort Macon first, so you don't get confused about that. They're only about a month apart, however. He captures New Bern, and the reason he wants to take New Bern next instead of Fort Macon is that Fort Macon, as we're going to see when you get up top, was never designed to defend itself from a land attack. It's designed to protect Beaufort and Beaufort Inlet. Since it's not designed to defend itself, the only way it can be defended from a land attack is by infantry, far out in front of the fort, and for that matter, miles, basically being in this vicinity. Burnside reasons quite correctly, I think, that if he sweeps this part of North Carolina free of Confederate infantry by taking New Bern and Morehead City and Beaufort, he has a much, much better opportunity to be able to take Fort Macon from the land side with fewer casualties. And so in March 1862, just about a week after the Battle of New Bern, which is March 14th, 1862, he details one of his three brigadier generals, Brigadier General John Parke, to come and try to take Fort Macon. General Parke sends a message to the commander of the fort, Colonel Moses J. White, a 27-year-old native of Vicksburg, Mississippi, demanding the surrender of the fort. Colonel White politely says no. This is on March 23rd, and we can mark that date as pretty much being the beginning of the siege of Fort Macon. There are about 400 men inside Fort Macon, but at any given time, about a third of those are on sick call. They don't live in the best conditions down here. I think they have it a little easier than soldiers out in the field, but nonetheless, this wouldn't be a bad place to pull duty, I suspect. But they know they're going to withstand a siege, and so they spend the next 2 or 3 weeks getting ready for that. They've got their ammunition checked, they've got their guns in top operating condition, they're doing gunnery practice. There are some raids back and forth in and outside the fort. They go outside the fort, they chop down every tree they can see to give them a clear field of fire. And then they also burn some buildings that are located outside the fort. They don't want to give the Union Army any hiding place, any place to be able to make an incursion up here close to the fort. Something else they do is interesting that you can see when you walk by and look at this, this drawing that was done after the bombardment here. You notice what appear to be these long poles leaning up against the walls of the fort. If you'll look around here, you'll notice that you have glass windows in these casemates. They originally all had glass windows. They did have heavy wooden shutters, but when you have a large mortar shell or an artillery round exploding on this parade ground and it's throwing shrapnel out, it's going to go right through those shutters and right through those windows. To try to protect this, they had a large quantity of railroad iron, and they took the railroad rails and simply leaned them up over the doors and the windows to try to add a little bit of extra protection. Well, the men here are just doing the best they can, but one problem they have is fresh water to drink and something good to eat. They're on fairly short rations here, and the problem with a siege is you don't know how long it's going to last, and so you have to make your food last as long as you possibly can. We're going to walk into a room now and I'm going to tell you a little bit of incident that occurs here involving making your food last as long as you possibly can. This is not the original bake oven. The original bake oven that sat here at the time of the Battle of Fort Macon was destroyed in the 1940s when the United States Army used this as an army post to watch out for Nazi U-boats. However, this has been rebuilt to the exact specifications. This is where they made their bread. Well, the men here are about to go to undergo a siege. They don't know how long they're going to be here, but it has always been the tradition at Fort Macon, as it was in the Army generally at the time on both sides, that each man is given his own little ration of flour. He can do with it what he wants. He can make anything to eat out of it he wants to make. The men really like this. Well, Colonel Moses White, who's the commander of the fort, finds out that one of the men in the garrison here, this is while all the Union troops are moving towards the fort and he knows he's going to be under siege, he ends up picking a fight because he finds out that one of the men among his garrison used to be a baker before the war. And he thinks, wait a minute, we've got this great big bake oven. I've got all this flour. I'll just have this former baker make all the bread. This makes sense. He doesn't know if this thing could last 1 day or 1 month or 1 year, this siege. And so he makes up what I think is a pretty smart call, and he says, okay, baker, you make all the bread, and he stops handing out flour to the men. Well, the baker might have been a baker before the war. If he was a lousy baker. The loaves come out black and shriveled and smoking and hard, and at first the men laugh about it, and they say, well, gosh, when the Yankees get here, we'll just shoot bread at them. You know, we're never going to run out of ammunition as long as we have flour. This guy's awful. So they laugh about it for a couple of days, and then all of a sudden, they realize this isn't funny anymore. They're getting hungry, and they don't have their bread, and they don't like the fact that their commanding officer is not listening to them. So they send a delegation through their NCOs and their officers up, and they say, the men, we really want our bread. I think you better give it back to them. The officers tell Colonel White that. He waves them off. He doesn't listen. Now it gets really serious. Some men actually desert, go over the wall, sneak away at night. They don't like the fact, number one, they're going to be shot at, and number two, they don't have any decent bread to eat. Who was it, Napoleon, I guess, that said an army travels on its stomach? Well, a garrison has to exist on its stomach too, and if you don't have men that are well fed and well rested, they're not very good soldiers. And so White is making a pretty big mistake by doing this. It gets so bad finally that the men prevail upon their NCOs to go to their officers, and they send a delegation into Colonel White's office, and the officers basically tell him, Colonel White, the men tell me to tell you if you don't give them their flour back, they're going to take it. I don't care what you have to say about it. They're taking their flour back. This is mutiny, basically. He waves them off and says, how dare they? Of course, he's incensed. He tells them immediately, put a guard over the bread, put a guard over the flour. The officers look at him and say, there's not a man in this fort that's willing to guard that flour, including us. The officers have had enough too. They didn't like the lousy bread either. With this, he knows he's whipped. He finally gives up and he lets the men have their bread back. I've always thought that one of the prime units that was in the fort at the time was an artillery unit from Wayne County called Andrews Battery. They had come in after the Goldsboro Rifles, and that's one of the chief units that was here. And I know we love our bread in Wayne County. I mean, we got Mickey's Pastry Shop, and we got the bakery and all that stuff. And I like to think some of the Andrews Battery guys were involved in what's called the Fort Macon bread riot. It wasn't so much as a riot, but it was definitely an uprising, let's put it that way. This is a neat little room. It's also always been said to be haunted. I can't say for sure whether it is. I spent 2 nights here in that corner in April at the reenactment sleeping on a cot. And we specifically chose this room because of the Wayne County connections and the bread riot and so forth. And it's always been said, and I've always heard this, I've camped in this fort many, many times, that if you leave the room and the oven door is closed, when you come back, it'll be open. If it's open and you come back, it'll be closed. I don't know whether it was some kid playing a trick on us or not, but I will say the weekend I spent in this room, sure enough, every time I come back in here, I wouldn't be gone 5 minutes, the door has been moved. I don't know what was going on, whether it's spirits or children playing a prank on us, I can't say, but I didn't see anything at least, let's put it that way. If you'll notice when we drove in, just before we got to the side of our, or actually just after our side of our hotel, there's a Division of Marine Fisheries building over there and a visitor center, Crystal Coast Visitor Center. That's near a place that used to be called Carolina City. There was a little sort of a crossroads there. It later became a large Confederate camp. And then the Union took it over when General Park was given the assignment of taking Fort Macon. He assembles a couple of regiments of infantry, although the infantry is never going to really storm this fort, and a large contingent of siege guns, mostly 8 and 10-inch siege mortars, as well as 30-pound Parrott rifles. And I'll explain about those in just a few minutes. He puts them on barges and he sails them across Bogue Sound. They land at Hoop Pole Creek, which is in what is today Atlantic Beach. Down, anybody know where the Beach Tavern is? Burt Surf Shop in that area, a little bit further down than that. That's called Hoop Pole Creek. General Park's soldiers land there. They unload all these guns. Now these are heavy, heavy guns. Some of the tubes weigh a couple of tons. These are huge things. If you think about it, they don't really have modern transportation like we have. It's a wonder that they got them across the dunes. This road didn't run down the center of the little peninsula like it does now. So they had to sort of drag these big guns out. They finally stopped about as close as they got about 1,300 yards from the fort. This is west. Atlantic Beach is 4 miles to the west. They finally stop in the dunes. You might have seen the marker as coming in. It says Union Artillery. Well, that's where they stop. They have to place their mortars, little stubby guns you see down there. Everybody see near where we came in? Those are called mortars. We still use them in the Army today, and they're designed to fire a high arcing shot that's going to go high in the sky and you can drop it down in a fortification. But they don't shoot as far as a Parrott rifle, so they have to be the closest. And then a couple of 100 yards behind that are the Parrott rifles within easy range of this fort. Well, General Park has got his men in the dunes over here, and when all is finally ready, remember the demand for the surrender was on March 23rd. It is now April 23rd. It's taken 30 days basically to get everything in place to assault this fort. When he is finally ready, General Burnside himself meets personally with Colonel Moses White and demands the surrender of the fort. And he politely declines. It always kills me when you read these letters back and forth. You'll have, "Dear Sir, I have the honor to demand the surrender of your fortification." The man writes back, "Dear Sir, thank you for your kind letter of the first instant. I have the honor to decline your kind invitation. I remain your most obedient servant." That sort of thing, but I'm going to kill you. But they were very nice about killing each other, at least. They were very, very polite people. We don't talk that way today, sadly, in some respects. Anyway, General Burnside on the 23rd of April makes a demand for the surrender of the fort. Colonel White says, "Well, no, thank you. I'm not gonna give you the fort." 2 days later, the morning of April 25th, 1862, at 5:40 in the morning, of course, it has to be early to shake the men up here, the guns boom out from the dunes back over in this direction, firing towards the fort. Well, this wakes the Confederates up, those that were not on duty at least, and they kind of scramble. They're throwing their brogans on, and they're fixing their suspenders and putting their caps on and getting ready to come up here and do battle. They run up these very staircases, and they man their guns, and they return fire at about 6 o'clock. At this point, Federal shells are coming into the fort at a rate of about 3 or 4 per minute, which will kind of shake you up a little bit. If you're in the casemates, you're reasonably well protected, but you just can't hide in the casemate the whole time. You're supposed to be up here ready to return fire. So these men have to stand out here in the open, and they're really at great risk at this point. There are shells exploding all around this place. I will tell you that when this fort was being done, fixed about, 10 years ago, I came down here with Gary Parton, who was one of the architects at the time, and he took me on a behind-the-scenes tour, and all this area back here, which was torn up at the time, there were cannonballs everywhere. Huge, huge cannonballs, big pieces of cannonballs, So these men were sort of having to dodge this, but they have to actually serve these guns under fire. That'd be a very unnerving thing to do. Just a little while after these guns have opened up on the fort and the fort begins to return fire, Union gunners all of a sudden start missing their target. There's a great deal of smoke emanating from the fort from the return fire. They can't really see what they're shooting at anymore. They just see a big cloud of smoke. Some of their shots are falling over the fort into the water. Some are falling short in the dunes. Fortunately for them, you can't see it now because the foliage has grown up, but Beaufort is directly in front of me back over here across the water. Remember, the Union Army has already taken Beaufort, and there's a hotel in Beaufort called the Atlantic Hotel. It's 2 or 3 stories tall. They can easily see Fort Macon from the top of this hotel. They have signal officers up top, and they begin signaling from the Atlantic Hotel in Beaufort to the gunnery officers on the dunes about 1,200 yards from the fort over here, adjust your fire. You're firing too long or you're firing too short. Finally, they adjust their fire. They don't have to see what they're shooting at because they're being told by signal flag how to adjust their fire. They finally adjust it, and after about noontime, after it had begun about 5:40 in the morning, almost every shot that's fired at this fort hits the fort. It is estimated they fired about 1,100 shots at the fort. They hit it about 600 times. That's a lot of damage here, and if you look at the walls around, you can see where it's been repaired many, many times. Well, just a little while after the fighting starts here, you have shells coming in for the dunes, you have these guns trying to return fire, but it becomes very evident at once that the Confederates are at a very serious disadvantage. For 2 reasons. Number one, they don't have any mortars. These little short stubby guns over here, they're being fired at them. These short mortar shells are falling on top of the parapet and in the bottom of the parade ground. The Confederates can't do that. They can't fire back and drop a shell behind a sand dune. Here's their bigger problem though. If you'll look, everybody step over here for just a moment. I want you to see something. See this lower wall down here? What do you not see there?
Guns.
No guns, no gun mounts. You have 2 in the corner, and if you look down the line here, there are only 2 on this side that can be brought to bear on the land side. Once again, this fort was meant to protect Beaufort Inlet and Beaufort. It was never meant to protect against a land attack. So you have very few guns that can actually return fire. Well, the guns behind us though, over here, the sea-facing guns, they're still in great shape. They can still be fired. And just a little while after the shooting starts here, the United States Navy makes an appearance in the waters outside the fort. There are 4 gunboats that appear in the waters in the ocean and the inlet directly out in this direction between here and Shackelford Banks, and they've been shelling the fort. Fortunately for the men inside the fort, it's a very, very rough day. There are high winds out here. The decks are pitching and rolling. They don't really hit the fort. However, the men inside the fort don't have that same limitation. They're used to all day long practicing firing at moving targets out there. They start firing back at the ships and they strike them several times. After a very short period of time, less than an hour, if those ships bear off, they've had enough of this and wild cheers erupt in the fort. This has been the only thing going to be cheered about the rest of the day. Every time a man comes up here to fire one of these guns, he is putting his life in danger, because what's happening is you have the mortar shells high in there, exploding up here, exploding in the parade ground, and then you have the 30-pound Parrott rifles, and I'll explain that in just a moment, picking these gunners off up here. The mortars are particularly dangerous to personnel. They're flying high through the air, they land down the parade ground, and they roll, and they have a fuse in them, and they're sort of sputtering as they're going. You don't know where it's going to hit, you don't know when it's going to go off. Here's another tragic Wayne County connection for us. One of the members of Andrews Battery, a man by the name of Benjamin Combs, Private Benjamin Combs from Wayne County, was down in the parade ground. He was either in or near the Sally Port, where we just came through, down by the mortars, when a 10-inch mortar shell came from the dunes, landed in the parade ground, rolled to his feet with the fuse still sputtering. He turns around, takes one step to try to run, and it explodes. It drives a huge piece of shrapnel into his back. It crushes him, drives his ribs through his organs. He screams in agony for about 3 hours before he finally dies. Amazingly, however, he's one of only 7 Confederate soldiers to be killed in the Battle of Fort Macon. I think that's astounding. Well, you still have the mortar shells dropping in here. This is a big problem, but here's where the biggest issue in the fall of Fort Macon comes about. There are 2 types of weapons, of artillery weapons in the American Civil War: smoothbore cannon and rifled cannon. Smoothbore is the gun like you see back here, and it sounds just like what it says. The inside of the tube or the barrel is smooth. It fires a round cannonball. Now, if you get hit by that round cannonball, it's still going to kill you. The problem is they're not terribly accurate. A round cannonball doesn't have any aerodynamic properties to it at all. It'll hit what you're aiming at as long as what you're aiming at is reasonably close. Rifle technology is something new at the time. You go inside a barrel and you cut spiral grooves inside the barrel. Then you fire a conical shell, looks like a modern artillery shell. The end of the shell they're made of iron, but the end of the shell either has brass or bronze or lead, something called a sabot on it. It's softer metal. When the hot gases are burning inside the tube, when you light the cannon, when it sets on fire, it takes this soft metal and it makes it expand, and it grips the rifle grooves inside that barrel, and it imparts a spin to the shell. So when the shell comes out a 30-pound Parrott rifle, it's spinning like a spiral football. It makes it a lot more accurate, and has a lot more killing power and punching power. It can actually punch its way through solid masonry walls like we have right here. Well, the first thing the Union Army does, they take their 30-pound Parrotts, and 30 pounds simply rates to the weight of the shell. That's not the weight of the gun. The tube weighs about 2 tons, but the shell weighs 30 pounds, and they start picking off the guns on the inlet face. You see the fresh brick over there that's not whitewashed? That's where it was struck time after time after time. Every single gun over there is going to be picked off. The crews are having a hard time crewing those guns. They're out of commission. They're sitting kilter. Their carriages have been destroyed. Then they start picking off the guns on the ocean side and on this land side. The men manning the guns out here on the lower parapet wall, these are 24-pounder guns. That's firing a 24-pound round cannonball. They are susceptible too. They're being picked off one by one by one. The guns are being destroyed. But that's not really the biggest factor in the fall of Fort Macon. If you step over here with me just a moment, I'll show you something in the parade ground. Notice there are 3 staircases that lead from the upper parapet down into the parade ground. Okay? There are 26 rooms, vaulted rooms, or casemates around this fort. But these 3 are special. They have regular casemates under these rooms, but each one of these 3 have a little ante-room, a little side room. They're powder magazines. And each one of them holds about 10 to 12,000 pounds of black powder. Well, guess who built this fort? The U.S. Army. The U.S. Army knows where the powder magazines are because they built the fort. Several of the officers who are participating in this attack on the fort have served at Fort Macon, so they know the danger points in this fort. So in this far corner that I'm pointing at, just on the other side of the staircase, the gunners eventually, who are manning these 30-pound Parrott rifles, begin chipping away at the outer wall out there. A 30-pound Parrott shell can do a lot of damage to brick. This fort, in a lot of ways, was outdated by the Civil War. You don't want to build something out of brick anymore. If you're firing a smooth round ball at it, that's one thing. But if you're firing a high-powered, heavy caliber shell like a Parrott rifle at it, a 30-pound Parrott rifle or a 100-pound Parrott rifle, you can do a lot of damage. And they start pounding away at the same spot. Every time they fire that Parrott rifle, it recoils backwards, but it doesn't really move up and down very much, and it doesn't move to the side very much. They roll it back into battery, they load it, they fire it again. They punch the same place over and over and over. And there are 3 of these long-range weapons firing at the same spot. About 4:30 in the afternoon, after all these 1,100 shells have been expended, there are wounded men inside the fort. There's some killed men inside the fort. Colonel White, who is in pretty much chronically poor health, he's epileptic. He's been in his quarters for a good part of the afternoon. He's sort of out of commission, but he's told he has trouble, and he sort of dodges shells, comes across the parade ground, dodging shells as he goes, and he makes an inspection of the powder magazine there, and he realizes to his horror that a huge crack has been opened in the outer wall leading up to the upper parapet. And he realizes pretty quickly that one lucky shot through that crack, and this fort is going to end up being a pile of brick dust. 35,000 pounds of black powder would do an incredible amount of damage to a fort like this. It would just completely destroy it and everyone in it. He determines, well, I've had it as long as I can. He ends up holding out about 11 hours. So 4:30 in the afternoon, they raised the white flag on the flagpole up here. It was in the same position that it is now. You can tell that from the old drawing that was done. He enters surrender negotiations with General Park. They sort of negotiate through the night because General Park calls on him to make an unconditional surrender. In other words, you give up and I'll tell you what you're going to do. With this, Colonel White says, well, 2 days ago, General Burnside offered me very generous terms. My men could go back to their homes. They can take their personal property with them. Officers can keep their sidearms. So they kind of dicker about this over and over again. Finally, they come to an agreement, and Burnside's original terms are going to be observed. The men are allowed to leave the fort the next morning on the 26th of April. If you notice from the drawing that we saw down here, the federal troops march through the Sally Port. They strike down the stars and bars, they raise the stars and stripes, and this is going to be a federal military installation for the remainder of the war. The losses here, 7 killed Confederate, 18 wounded. The federal losses are truly amazing. Only 3 wounded and 1 unlucky man killed. Here's how he gets killed though. This is pretty bad. He's standing on a sand dune back here in a lull in the fighting, and he climbs up on top of the dune to get a better look. Just about that time, one of the very few guns at Fort Macon that can train its weapons on the land side is a 32-pounder. It fires a 32-pound cannonball, which would be about the size of what I'm pointing to down here on the parade ground. It strikes him square in the chest. He basically disintegrates. He never knew what hit him. So that's the only man killed on the federal side of the Battle of Fort Macon. All right, if we could, Kirk, can you do a quick, about a 5-minute talk? We got another. We've got another Wayne County connection here. These are 32 Model 1841 32-pounders. These could be either rifled or they could be smoothbore, depending on what variety they were. The fort has always had, for several years, a fiberglass model here on a wooden carriage, but the wood tended to rot, and guess what? You can't fire a cannonball, or you can't even fire a blank out of fiberglass. And so they wanted some fireable models. And who do they call on? They call on Wayne County, of course. It's the Wayne County connection. And Kirk's going to tell us a little bit about it.
We were fortunate enough to be contacted about a little over 3 years ago. The connection being the cliffs of the new state park, who holds the hub capital of the state park system. They were looking some help for the corrosive factors that occur into the wood as wooden carriages, as Randy was mentioning. And so they knew that we had a mechanical engineering program, of which I helped as an instructor, and also knew the love we had of history and the connection of Goldsboro. They came in and asked, would we take on a project to convert the copies of the 1830 prints that they had of the barbette carriage, of which these are. They consist of a carriage that rests upon a chassis. The carriage holds the cannon barrel. Then you've got the carriage and then the chassis that it slides upon. Once we agreed to do the prints in modern CAD drawings to be able to replicate the wooden carriage in an aluminum form, they came back and asked us, would we also take on the job of machining the 1/4-inch aluminum tubing that now sits on these ramparts, and weld them into position, the subcomponents, so that they could bring back to life a firing model that had not occurred here in over 100 years. That process started with one carriage, of which you see here. It fired for about a year, 4-pound charges, black powder, makes a big boom, a lot of smoke. It was a big tourist attraction. With that and a savings of $20,000 that the college saved them, and the work of all the faculty of the applied technology and over 200 students, we provided 2 more carriages at a cost or savings of $20,000 each for the state. And of course, we've got the recognition of the only college in the United States to be able to do this for a state park system, and a lot of pride goes along with that. Also, recruiting power of what our programs offer. It also allows us to have a lot more scholarships for the foundation of which this trip that we're taking now is being sponsored. A lot of pride rests here, and if you get a chance, there's a plaque on each one of these barbette carriages that acknowledge the fact that Wayne Community College of Goldsboro, North Carolina, provided the workmanship and training for students to the mechanical engineering, the welding, and machining departments. And what you see here is the proud reward of that and the recognition. And believe me, the tourism they fire these once a week during the summer months, and it has brought in a tremendous amount of tourism just for what they are.
You see the little divots in the staircase here? Boom, 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 boom. Cannonball. It has always been thought that probably a mortar shell struck and bounded and just kind of bam, 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 bam. I'd like to think that's true. I think it's probably just as likely that some soldiers were carrying one up and probably dropped it. but nevertheless, those are divots from a shell. You can see the little indentation they made. Step in here, I want to show you one of these casemates. Okay, this is one of the 26 vaulted casemates in this fort. You can see that that you have sort of a barrel ceiling in here. This just give added strength to it because they have a large quantity of dirt up top, basically to absorb the shock of incoming fire and to absorb the shock of outgoing fire. When these guns fire, it makes quite a racket and there's a lot of reverberation, a lot of shaking from it. This is casemate number 18. I spend the night in here about 3 times a year, about 6 nights a year. That's my spot right over there. We have a fireplace in each one of them, which we don't use, obviously. You've probably all heard the story of the last casualties at Fort Macon, the Yankees who were injured here in World War II. This was a coast battery station, U-boat watching station in World War II. The United States Army took over the fort from the state of North Carolina. It had already been a state park. They put it back into service. Troops were quartered here. A large number of the troops that were quartered with a Coast Artillery Battalion were from New York and New Jersey. They came in one of the casemates here and they were building fires in the fireplace to make themselves warm, what they could certainly do. Some of them found some cannonballs and thought, wow, this would make a nice andiron. And they put the cannonballs in front and they had logs behind it burning and it got hot and one of them did blow up. Didn't kill anybody, but it injured a couple of guys. And of course, they've always quipped that these Confederate cannonballs hurt some Yankees 80 some years after the war. It's a great story, and in this case, it happens to be true. I brought you this particular casemate, though, because this is the little door. This is the powder magazine. If you notice, it's under. The reason they put it here, it gives a little bit of extra protection. If fire is coming in from the ocean from this direction, it has to go through the staircase before it could ever get into the powder magazine. Of course, the problem is they were planning on being shot at from there. They weren't really planning on being shot at from there. So the outside of the wall here is the one that gets punctured several times by these 30-pound Parrott rifles, putting this powder magazine at risk. If I'm a man in this room, I'd be very, very nervous. This would be a very bad place to be. Somebody asked about the little oven out in the parade ground. That is called a hot shot furnace. They didn't use that during the Battle of Fort Macon, but here's what it was designed for. When this fort was built, of course, this is before ironclads, and all the ships of the day were wooden sailing ships with ropes and tar and wood and sails and canvas and lots of flammable things. They would build a fire in the bottom of the oven. They would take cannonballs and roll down into racks on top of the oven and superheat them. Then they would pick them up with tongs, carry them up the staircase, place them in a cannon and fire them at a wooden ship trying to set it on fire. So it's just called a hot shot furnace. As it turns out, they didn't really need to do that. Their bigger problem was coming, in this case, from the land side. This is called the ditch. People generally call it a moat, but it's actually called the ditch. It originally was designed so that it would flood with the tides. But guess what? When you get water in here, what do you think you get? Mosquitoes. So they decided they would get rid of the idea of the flooding moat. That was not a terribly good idea. There's something else here. See these rooms in the corner of the fort here? You have one here, you have one on the other side of the fort, and you have one we can't see right now. These are called counterfire batteries. What these are designed for, if infantry ever were to attack this fort and overwhelm it and get it out into the ditch, you have your side's infantry, if you have any, putting their rifles through these loopholes, these little openings, and then these larger places, they have cannons. Everybody see the small gun over here on the far wall? That's a 32-pound carronade. That gun would have been mounted in one of these openings, and it's designed to fire through through this opening and along the length of the ditch. Now, it's not firing a solid cannonball, it's not firing an exploding round, it's firing something called canister. It's like a big shotgun shell, and it would just pepper these troops with big iron or lead balls and kill them, or at least then make them think twice about trying to assault the fort through the ditch here. I also want to point out, everybody see the miscolored brick here? It's all the holes, especially along this side. This is the land side. This is the casemate we were just in. The powder magazine is right behind this door right here. Ever see that big crack? That's where those 30-pound Parrott rifles keep punching through. They're punching through this wall, trying to cause as much damage as they can here. No, and they don't really want to blow the fort up, by the way. They just want to make Colonel White think twice about holding out, because he knows the fort is going to blow up eventually if they punch through here. So that's why you have the miscolored brick. These are the repairs that have been done. As we walk around here towards the front of the fort, you'll notice there are large chunks of the bricks missing. It's all been repaired, but the whitewash didn't stick to it quite as good after that. When we pass by, we'll be passing by this little 32-pound carronade. they sort of took them and they mounted them on an incline here and sort of made them into mortars. And they had to experiment with how much powder they would use as a charge to shoot the right amount of time, because it wasn't designed for this, to try to strike the Federal batteries. They were very ineffective, but at least they tried. Looking back, you get a really good idea of the shell damage, particularly on this side. This fort took a lot of punishment, 1,100 shells.